Have you ever wondered what it was truly like for a woman in 780 living in a world so utterly different from our own? Could she choose her own path? What if her heart yearned for a life devoted to God, a life of learning and piety within cloistered walls? What incredible obstacles stood in her way? Number 1. The chains of patriarchy, a woman's lack of agency and legal power. Imagine a society where your very existence, your choices, your future, were rarely your own to decide. This was the stark reality for women in 780, at a time when the powerful hand of patriarchy held an almost absolute grip on every aspect of life. For a woman, particularly a young one, aspiring to a religious life was not simply a personal calling. It was a decision that required permission, negotiation, and often significant sacrifice from forces far beyond her control. In this era, often referred to as the Carolingian period, women were legally considered minors, regardless of their age or wisdom. Their legal standing was, to put it simply, non-existent in the modern sense. A woman was born into her father's household and, upon marriage, transitioned into the household of her husband. Her identity, her property, even her children were not hers in the way we understand ownership today. This fundamental lack of legal agency meant that the personal desire for a cloistered life, no matter how fervent, could easily be extinguished by the will of her male relatives. Think of it, if a young woman, let us call her Ethelred, felt a deep spiritual yearning to dedicate her life to prayer and scholarship within a convent, she could not simply pack a small bag and leave. She needed her father's explicit consent. If her father was a powerful landholder, perhaps even a minor noble, Ethelred was a valuable asset in his political and economic chess game. A daughter was a bargaining chip, a means to forge alliances, secure land, or improve the family's social standing through marriage. To lose Ethelred to the church meant losing a potential dowry from a desirable suitor, losing a connection to another powerful family, and possibly even losing a chance to secure the family's lineage through future grandchildren. The financial and social calculations of the family almost always trumped the individual's spiritual aspirations. Historical records from the time, like various capitularies issued by Charlemagne, often discuss the rights and duties of men, but rarely do they grant women significant autonomy. Their roles were defined by domesticity and subservience. Even if a woman was a widow, she often remained under the guardianship of a male relative, perhaps her eldest son, brother, or even her deceased husband's family. Her property, if she had any, was often tied to her male kin. This meant that the notion of a woman making an independent life-altering decision, like entering a convent, was almost revolutionary. It challenged the very fabric of societal order. Church, while offering an alternative path, still operated within these societal norms. While it championed piety and spiritual devotion, it did not overtly challenge the patriarchal structures that governed daily life. For instance, the very foundation of monastic life, the rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most convents in the West, emphasized obedience and hierarchy. While an abbess held significant power within her community, she still often answered to a male bishop or a local noble patron. Consider the potential for resistance. A woman who expressed a desire for religious life might face strong emotional pressure, even outright coercion from her family. They might emphasize her duty to her family, her duty to produce heirs, her duty to uphold the family name. The concept of individual fulfillment, as we understand it today, was largely alien. Life was communal, and individuals were expected to contribute to the collective good of the family unit. For Ethelred, this could mean heart-making arguments, silent disapproval, or even threats of disinheritance. Her family might simply ignore her pleas, arranging a marriage regardless of her wishes. There were no legal avenues for her to appeal, no court system to protect her personal freedom to choose a life of religious devotion. power structures of 780 and ensured that a woman's voice, her deepest desires, were often silenced by the louder voices of her male guardians, making the journey to a religious life an incredibly difficult, almost impossible, undertaking for many. Number 2. The scarcity of sacred spaces, limited convents, and influence. Imagine you live in a world where the path you dream of pursuing, a life of deep devotion and scholarship within a religious community, is not just difficult to access, but genuinely rare. For women in 780, this was the harsh reality concerning convents and female monastic institutions. While monasteries for men, guided by the robust rule of Saint Benedict, were relatively widespread across the burgeoning Carolingian Empire, convents for women were fewer in number, often less well-funded, and sometimes far more isolated. This scarcity presented a monumental hurdle for any woman seeking to dedicate her life to God. First, let's consider the geographical distribution. In an age before widespread literacy and easy communication, news of a distant convent might simply not reach a young woman in a rural village. Travel was perilous and slow, so even if she heard of a convent, getting there was an odyssey in itself. The majority of convents were established by wealthy noble families or royal patronage, often attached to larger landholdings. This meant they were not evenly spread across the landscape. One might find a cluster of monastic institutions in a specific region favored by a powerful duke or king, while other vast territories had no established convents at all. For a woman like Hildegard, living on the fringes of a minor lord's estate, the closest convent might be days, even weeks, of arduous travel away. And without the support of her family, even knowing such places existed was a challenge, let alone reaching them. Second, the capacity of existing convents was limited. These institutions were not simply open houses. They had strict rules regarding the number of nuns they could support, the resources they possessed, and the space available within their cloistered walls. Convent might only be able to accommodate a few dozen women, and vacancies were often few and far between. Furthermore, entry was often competitive, especially for convents known for their piety, learning, or prestige. Families with influence and wealth would often secure places for their daughters years in advance, sometimes even placing young girls in convents as oblates, children offered to the monastery, from a very young age. For a woman from a less affluent or less connected background, gaining entry could be an insurmountable barrier, even if she managed to locate a convent. Moreover, the influence and stability of these convents varied greatly. While some, like Remiremont or Chelles in Francia, were powerful, wealthy, and commanded respect, many smaller, lesser-known convents struggled for resources and protection. A thriving convent relied heavily on the patronage of powerful families or rulers. Without such support, it could fall into decline, be vulnerable to raids, or simply not have the means to provide the rigorous intellectual and spiritual life a seeking woman might envision. Quality of religious life, the access to precious manuscripts, and the caliber of the instruction could differ immensely between these institutions. A woman yearning for a life of learning might find herself in a convent that focused primarily on manual labor and prayer, with little opportunity for the intellectual pursuits she craved. Finally, the leadership within these convents, the abbesses, played a crucial role. Powerful learned abbesses, like Gazella, Charlemagne's sister, who led Chelles, could attract promising women and ensure the convent's prosperity and intellectual vibrancy. However, such figures were not ubiquitous. Some convents might be led by less capable or less pious women, or might be embroiled in local political disputes, making them less appealing or even unsafe for prospective nuns. The scarcity of these sacred spaces, combined with the often limited access, financial burdens, and varying quality, meant that for many women in 780 AD, the path to a religious life remained largely out of reach. A distant dream glimpsed only by a fortunate few. Number 3. The unyielding discipline, a life of austerity and rigor. Imagine a life stripped bare of almost all personal comfort, a daily existence governed by the relentless tolling of bells, demanding an almost superhuman dedication to prayer, labor, and silence. This was the reality of monastic life in 780, particularly for women who entered convents, operating under the rule of Saint Benedict. While the spiritual calling might be strong, the sheer physical and mental rigor of convent life was an obstacle in itself, one that few in our modern age could truly comprehend, let alone endure. This was not a soft option, nor an escape from hardship. For many, it was a plunge into an even more demanding existence. Let's talk about the daily schedule. Nuns rose in the deep of night, often around 2 a.m., for matins, the first of 7 daily offices of prayer. After a few hours of sleep, they would rise again for lauds at dawn. Then prime, terce, sextinon, vespers, and compline, spread throughout the day and into the evening. This structured prayer was interspersed with manual labor, farming, weaving, spinning, sewing, cooking, cleaning, which was essential for the convent's self-sufficiency. There was little time for leisure, and personal pursuits were almost non-existent. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized obedience, humility, and silence. Nuns were expected to speak only when necessary, and conversation was generally forbidden outside of designated times or in specific areas. This profound silence, while conducive to contemplation for some, could be incredibly isolating for others, especially those accustomed to family life and social interaction. Food was simple and often sparse. Meat was generally forbidden except for the very ill. Meals consisted of bread, vegetables, pulses, and perhaps fish or eggs on certain days. Fasting was common, especially during Advent and Lent, where meals might be reduced to 1 a day. Sleep was limited, and beds were often simple pallets, sometimes straw-filled. There was no heating as we know it. Convents could be bitterly cold in winter. Hygiene was basic, and illnesses were often treated with herbal remedies, with little access to advanced medical care. The physical demands alone were immense, especially for women who might have grown up in a more comfortable or less physically demanding environment. Transition from a family home to such a rigorous, disciplined life could be a profound shock to the system, causing physical ailments, mental exhaustion, or even despair. Furthermore, the rule stressed humility and the shedding of individual will. Personal possessions were almost entirely relinquished. Nuns wore simple, uniform habits, symbolizing their detachment from the world and their equality within the community. There was no room for personal expression or individual flair. For a young woman, perhaps one from a noble family accustomed to fine clothes, servants, and a certain degree of personal freedom, this radical stripping away of identity and comfort could be an incredibly daunting prospect. The spiritual journey required absolute surrender, a breaking of the ego that was a profound test of faith and endurance. Consider the mental and emotional toll. The constant routine, the lack of privacy, the rigorous self-discipline, and the isolation from the outside world could lead to homesickness, depression, or a sense of confinement. While many found profound peace and spiritual growth in this life, it was not for everyone. The austerity was a deliberate part of the spiritual training, designed to detach the soul from worldly desires and focus it entirely on God. But for women not prepared for such a radical transformation, or for those whose underlying physical or mental constitution was not robust enough, the unyielding discipline of the convent was a very real and overwhelming obstacle to a life of piety. It was a path chosen not lightly, and certainly not by the faint of heart. Number 4, the threat of the sword. War, raids, and political instability. Imagine wanting to dedicate your life to peace and contemplation, but living in a world constantly threatened by violence, where even sacred spaces were not always safe havens. This was the precarious existence in 780, at a period marked by ongoing political instability, localized warfare, and the nascent threat of devastating raids that would soon become a defining feature of the early medieval landscape. For a woman contemplating religious life, the external world's instability posed a very real and terrifying obstacle. The pursuit of spiritual quietude was often overshadowed by the clang of steel and the fear of invasion. While Charlemagne was consolidating his vast empire at this time, bringing a degree of order to large swaths of Western Europe, this order was far from absolute. There were still numerous internal conflicts, rebellions by conquered peoples like the Saxons, and border skirmishes with neighboring kingdoms or pagan tribes. Local lords often engaged in feuds, leading to widespread disruption and danger for ordinary people. For example, chronicles from the era frequently mention raiding parties, whether from disgruntled nobles, bandits, or tribal groups, who would plunder villages, kidnap people, and destroy property. Convents, often self-sufficient and holding valuable goods like land, silver, and precious manuscripts, were not immune from such depredations. In fact, their perceived wealth and relative defenselessness could make them attractive targets. Consider a young woman, perhaps named Bertha, living in a region prone to these conflicts. Her family might be hesitant to allow her to travel to a distant convent, fearing for her safety on the road. Bandits were a constant menace, and without a heavily armed escort, any journey was fraught with risk. Even if she reached a convent, its long-term security was far from guaranteed. Accounts exist of convents being sacked, their inhabitants dispersed, or worse. The thought of dedicating one's life to a community that could be destroyed overnight, with its residents put to the sword or carried off into captivity, was a terrifying prospect. Religious life was meant to offer protection and sanctuary, but in this turbulent age, even the walls of a cloister could not always guarantee safety. Moreover, the nascent threat of Viking raids was just beginning to emerge in the late 8th century, though they would become more widespread in the following decade. While 780 AD might be a little early for the full impact of these northern invaders to be felt across all of Europe, the general insecurity and the fear of foreign incursions were pervasive. Coastal areas and regions along major rivers, which were often routes for trade and settlement, were particularly vulnerable. A family might deem it too dangerous to send a daughter to a convent located near a river or coastline, fearing she would become a victim of a sudden brutal attack. Political landscape was fluid, and the concept of a strong, centralized state providing universal security was still centuries away. Protection often depended on the local lord's power and willingness to defend his territory. The very choice of religious life, therefore, carried an inherent risk. While it offered spiritual solace and a structured existence, it did not entirely insulate a woman from the brutal realities of her time. Constant threat of violence, whether from internal strife or external invaders, cast a long shadow over the aspirations of women like Bertha, making the journey to and the maintenance of a religious life a daunting challenge, often fraught with the very real danger of the sword. Number 5. The silent stigma. Societal misunderstandings and suspicions. Imagine a society where a woman's primary value was inextricably linked to her ability to marry, produce heirs, and manage a household. In such a world, a woman who chose to forego these fundamental roles for a life of religious devotion, while outwardly respected for her piety, might also face subtle, and sometimes not so subtle forms of societal misunderstanding. This silent stigma was a significant obstacle for women in 780 at seeking a religious life, as it could undermine family support, social standing, and even her own confidence in her calling. While religious life was undeniably seen as a path to spiritual purity and salvation, it was also, in a practical sense, an unusual deviation from the norm. For a powerful family, a daughter entering a convent meant one less opportunity for a strategic alliance through marriage. This could lead to a silent disapproval, a lingering sense of disappointment that she was not fulfilling her societal duty. The family might outwardly present her choice as a pious one, but privately harbor resentment or a sense of loss. Imagine young Giselda, a noble woman whose family had meticulously planned her marriage to a neighboring lord. If Giselda expressed a desire for the cloister, her family might view it not as a spiritual calling, but as an evasion of her responsibilities, a sign of weakness, or even an ungrateful rejection of their efforts to secure her future. This pressure, even if unspoken, could be immensely difficult to bear. Furthermore, there could be a subtle suspicion about the true motivations behind a woman's choice. Was she genuinely pious, or was she simply trying to escape an undesirable arranged marriage? Was she perhaps ill, or unable to find a husband? Was she hiding some secret shame or physical imperfection that made her unfit for marriage? While religious life was seen as honorable, these underlying questions could create a shadow of doubt around a woman's decision. Historical records and literary works from the period sometimes hint at such assumptions, portraying women who chose religious life as either exceptionally saintly or, conversely, as somehow unfit for secular life. This societal lens, judging women based on their marital status and reproductive capacity, meant that stepping outside of this framework, even for a spiritual reason, could lead to subtle forms of ostracism or a lessened social standing for her family. For women from lower social strata, the stigma might be different, but equally potent. If a working-class family had little land or wealth, every daughter was a potential laborer, a future wife, who could bring stability or aid to the household. Losing a daughter to a convent, especially if a dowry was required, which we will discuss later, could be seen as an economic burden or an act of self-indulgence that the family simply could not afford. Neighbors might whisper about the family's piety, or lack thereof, if they struggled to support a daughter in religious life, or if they seemed to be giving her away for obscure reasons. The silent stigma also affected the women themselves. Faced with family disappointment, societal questioning, and the inherent loneliness of a path less traveled, a woman might begin to doubt her own calling. Was she truly being guided by God, or was she just deluding herself? The emotional and psychological weight of these unexpressed societal judgments could be a heavy burden, making it even harder for a woman to commit fully to a life that, while spiritually fulfilling, was largely misunderstood by many outside its walls. This subtle but pervasive form of societal pressure was a profound obstacle, often forcing women to justify their deepest spiritual desires to a world that struggled to see beyond traditional roles. Number 6. A world shrouded in illiteracy, the education gap. Imagine living in a time where the written word was a rare and precious commodity, inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. In 780, this was the reality, and for women, the illiteracy rate was astronomically high. While convents were often beacons of learning, centers where manuscripts were copied and intellectual life flourished, the fundamental lack of educational opportunities outside these cloistered walls presented a significant barrier for many women aspiring to a religious life. How could one yearn for a life of scripture and scholarship if one had never learned to read? For the vast majority of women, education consisted of practical skills related to household management, child-rearing, and manual labor. Whether she was a peasant's daughter learning to spin wool or a noblewoman learning to manage a large estate, formal literacy was simply not a common expectation. Even among the nobility, daughters were often educated in manners, music, and perhaps some basic arithmetic. But reading and writing were often reserved for sons destined for clerical careers or high-ranking administrative roles. This was not due to a lack of intelligence in women, but rather a reflection of societal priorities and the scarcity of educational resources. There were no public schools as we know them, and private tutoring was only for the exceptionally wealthy. This widespread illiteracy created a profound obstacle for women seeking religious life. Monastic life, particularly in convents, was deeply rooted in literacy. The daily offices involved reading psalms and scriptures. Meditation often involved reading spiritual texts, and the copying of manuscripts was a vital monastic activity. For a woman to enter a convent, even if she did not arrive fully literate, she needed to be capable of learning and ideally possess some foundational knowledge. While some convents might have accepted unlettered women and taught them to read and write, this was often a challenging process, and it meant that a woman would spend her initial years catching up rather than immediately immersing herself in the deeper spiritual and intellectual life. For a young woman from a peasant family, like Agnes, who had spent her life working in the fields, the very concept of books and writing might be utterly alien, let alone the rigorous intellectual demands of a convent. Moreover, the lack of literacy meant a lack of access to spiritual texts that might inspire a woman's calling in the first place. How could one feel drawn to the profound wisdom of the Church Fathers or the beauty of the Psalms if one could not read them? Knowledge of faith was often transmitted orally through sermons and community practices, which was sufficient for daily piety, but perhaps less effective in sparking a deep intellectual yearning for a cloistered life. A woman might have a strong faith, but without the intellectual tools, she might not even realize the full scope of what a religious life could offer beyond simple devotion. While it is true that some powerful convents, often led by learned abbesses, became centers of scholarship, attracting women who desired intellectual pursuits, these were the exception, not the rule. The very ability to learn to read and write was a privilege, almost a mark of status, that was largely denied to women in 780 AD. The education gap created a silent yet formidable barrier, limiting the pool of women who could realistically aspire to a life of intellectual and spiritual devotion within the walls of a convent, effectively making it a path reserved for a very select few. Number 7. The perilous journey to a cloistered life. Imagine the journey to your chosen destination is not merely a matter of buying a ticket and hopping on a comfortable carriage, but an epic, dangerous undertaking, fraught with peril. For a woman in 780 and seeking to reach a distant convent, the act of travel itself was a formidable obstacle, often making the dream of a religious life seem impossibly far away. The roads were primitive, dangers lurked everywhere, and the very concept of safe, long-distance travel for women was almost non-existent without significant resources and protection. Transportation in 780 AD was incredibly basic. Roads, if they existed at all beyond local tracks, were often remnants of Roman engineering, now crumbling and poorly maintained. They were muddy in winter, dusty in summer, and almost impassable after heavy rains. Travel was conducted on foot, by horse, or in slow, cumbersome ox carts. A journey of just 50 miles could take several days, exposing travelers to the elements and unforeseen dangers for an extended period. For a young woman from a village, perhaps, the longest journey she had ever undertaken might have been to the nearest market town. Prospect of traveling across unfamiliar territories, possibly through dense forests or over treacherous hills, would be terrifying. The greatest danger on these medieval roads was not just the rough terrain, but the lurking human threats. Bandits were a constant menace. Disbanded soldiers, desperate peasants, or simply opportunistic criminals roamed the countryside, preying on isolated travelers. A lone woman, or even a small group, was a prime target for robbery, kidnapping, or worse. For a family, allowing their daughter to travel to a convent, ensuring her safety would be a paramount concern, and often an insurmountable financial one. They would need to arrange for a heavily armed escort, a group of trustworthy men to protect her, which was an expense few families could afford. Without such protection, a woman embarking on such a journey would be putting her life and her purity at extreme risk. Beyond human threats, the natural world itself posed dangers. Wild animals, like wolves or bears, were far more common in the extensive forests of Europe than they are today. Rivers had to be forded or crossed by unreliable ferries. Illness was rampant, and a sudden fever or infection contracted on the road could prove fatal without access to any significant medical care. Sleeping outdoors or in rough, unhygienic inns also increased the risk of disease. Imagine young Theodora, her heart set on entering a convent known for its holiness, but separated from it by hundreds of miles of perilous terrain. Her family's anxieties about her safety, their inability to provide a suitable escort, or the sheer logistical nightmare of the journey itself could easily extinguish her hopes. Moreover, the very societal norms of the time made unsupported female travel almost unthinkable. A woman traveling alone or without obvious male protection was seen as vulnerable, perhaps even of questionable repute. Her reputation, and by extension her family's, could be irrevocably damaged. The societal expectation was for women to remain within the confines of their household or community, unless accompanied and protected. This deeply ingrained social barrier, combined with the genuine physical dangers of the roads, meant that for many women in 780, and the perilous journey to a cloistered life was not merely an inconvenience, but a life-threatening obstacle that effectively confined their spiritual aspirations. Number 8. The steep price of piety, the dowry for a convent. Imagine that even when you choose a life of religious devotion, a life ostensibly focused on spiritual wealth rather than material possessions, you are still confronted with a significant financial barrier. For women in 780, and the practice of a dowry or a substantial entrance gift to the convent was a common and often prohibitive obstacle to entering religious life. While a secular dowry served to secure a woman's position in marriage and often contributed to the marital household, a convent dowry was a donation made to the institution, a necessary contribution for a woman to be accepted into the community, and it could be a crippling expense for many families. This practice, while not universally formalized in every single convent, was widespread and often essential for the financial stability of the religious community. Convents, like any other institution, needed resources to function. They required funds for daily upkeep, food, clothing, heating, the maintenance of buildings, and the purchase of books and supplies for scholarly work. While some convents owned land and were self-sufficient, many relied on patronage and the donations of those entering. A dowry, or donation, from a new nun's family was often seen as her contribution to the communal resources she would now be utilizing. It wasn't about buying her way in, but rather providing a financial underpinning for her upkeep, ensuring she wouldn't be a burden on the existing community. The amount of this dowry could vary wildly, depending on the wealth and prestige of the convent. A highly renowned convent with powerful abbesses and a reputation for strict piety and scholarship would likely demand a more substantial contribution. For a noble family, this might involve a significant sum of money, a piece of land, valuable jewels, or even a number of serfs to work the convent's estates. For a family of lesser means, even a smaller gift could represent an impossible financial strain. Imagine young Egypth, whose family were minor landowners. They might possess enough to provide a small dowry for a marriage, perhaps a few head of cattle or some simple linen. The amount required by a nearby reputable convent might be far beyond their reach, a sum that would cripple their family's finances for years, perhaps even forcing them into debt. This financial burden put families in a difficult position. On one hand, allowing a daughter to enter a convent was seen as a pious act bringing spiritual merit to the family. On the other hand, it meant a direct financial outlay without the direct economic or social return that a marriage alliance would bring. In a society where resources were often scarce and familial survival was paramount, the financial calculus was stark. Some families might simply be unable to afford the cost, regardless of their daughter's fervent desire. They might have other daughters to marry off, sons to equip for military service or a church career, and limited assets to spread among them. The choice to send a daughter to a convent might be seen as an unaffordable luxury. Furthermore, there was often no recourse if a family could not pay. While some exceptional cases of particularly devout women might be accepted without a full dowry, this was rare and often required powerful patronage or a special dispensation. For the vast majority, the inability to provide the expected financial contribution meant that the door to the convent remained firmly closed. The steep price of piety, therefore, was a very tangible and often insurmountable obstacle, meaning that for many women in 780 the path to a religious life, no matter how strong their spiritual calling, was simply unattainable due to the material demands of the institution itself. Number 9. The iron grip of family expectations and arranged marriages. Imagine your future is not your own to shape, but a meticulously constructed plan laid out by your family, designed to bolster their power, secure their land, and enhance their social standing. This was the overwhelming reality for young women in 780, and where the iron grip of family expectations and the pervasive practice of arranged marriages served as arguably the most formidable obstacle to a woman seeking a religious life. A daughter was a valuable asset, a living bridge to alliances, and her personal desires often held little sway against the powerful currents of dynastic ambition and economic necessity. In the Carolingian era, marriage was not primarily a matter of romantic love or individual choice. It was a socio-economic contract. For noble families, daughters were crucial pawns in the intricate game of political strategy. Marrying a daughter into a powerful neighboring family could secure peace, forge military alliances, or consolidate landholdings. For families of lesser standing, a marriage could mean economic stability, access to labor, or even a slight bump in social status. A daughter, therefore, represented a potential dowry from the husband's family, or she was the vessel through which a dowry of her own could be provided to entice a desirable match. Either way, she was a resource, and giving her up to the church meant losing a vital strategic piece from the family's chessboard. Consider the patriarch of a family. Let us call him Lord Egbert. He has several daughters. Each one represents a potential opportunity to expand his influence, secure his borders, or gain favor with the king. If his eldest daughter, Freya, expresses a deep spiritual yearning to enter a convent, Lord Egbert would likely view this as a disaster. It means the loss of a valuable alliance with the family he had painstakingly negotiated with for years. It means the loss of potential grandchildren who would secure his lineage. It means a financial outlay for a convent dowry, as discussed previously, rather than receiving one or exchanging lands through marriage. For Egbert, Freya's personal spiritual fulfillment would be a secondary, if not entirely irrelevant concern compared to the very real and immediate implications for his family's survival and prosperity. The pressure on women, like Freya, would have been immense. It might begin with subtle hints, escalating to direct demands and potentially even threats of disinheritance or social isolation. Her family would emphasize her duty to them, her duty to perpetuate the family name, her duty to God through fulfilling her societal role. In a communal society where the individual was subsumed by the family unit, these arguments carried enormous weight. There was no concept of individual human rights or the freedom to choose one's own path. A woman was born into a specific societal role, and her life was expected to serve the needs of her family and, by extension, the broader social order. Furthermore, refusing an arranged marriage, even for spiritual reasons, could have severe consequences for the entire family. Could insult a powerful potential ally, leading to feuds, economic sanctions, or even armed conflict. The ripple effects of a daughter's rebellion could be catastrophic. While the Church offered an alternative to marriage, it rarely actively encouraged women to defy their families, understanding the societal structures of the time. For many women in 780, the intense, unwavering pressure from their families to fulfill their marital obligations, tethering them to a preordained future that left little to no room for a personal, spiritual calling to the cloister. The very idea of choosing her own path was a revolutionary concept, one that most women simply did not have the power or the social permission to entertain.